Well, good afternoon. Welcome to the third annual Getzen Lecture in Government Accountability. I'm Tom Loth, the Dean of the School of Public and International Affairs. And on behalf of the school and the Department of Public Administration and Policy, I'm pleased to welcome Lee Hamilton as this year's Getzen Lecturer. Before introducing Congressman Hamilton, I want to recognize a special guest. The Getzen Lecture in Government Accountability is made possible through the generosity of University of Georgia alumni Catherine Getzen Willoughby and Dan Hall Willoughby, she of the School of Public and International Affairs, Department of Public Administration and Policy, and he of the university's law school. And the lecture is in honor of Catherine's parents. Unfortunately, Professor and Mrs. Getzen were unable to be here today, and Dan Willoughby was following his dictates of his law firm this afternoon, and on short notice is unable to attend as well. But Catherine is with us. Catherine, thanks so much for your generosity in support of our school and in support of our students. Why don't you stand up? Despite your protestations, the Honorable Lee H. Hamilton currently is President and Director of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. He served for 34 years, that's 17 terms, students, as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives from Indiana's 9th Congressional District. During his tenure in office, he served as chair of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs and the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. His service to our country also includes co-chair of the Iraq Study Group and vice chairman of the 9/11 Commission, and currently membership on the President's Homeland Security Advisory Council. He's a graduate of Indiana University Law School, and prior to entering government, he practiced law in Chicago and in Columbus, Indiana. Before I bring him to the podium, let me ask if everyone would do as I have just done and turn off cell phone. And to remind you that there will be questions and answers following the lecture, and there are microphones here in the front of the auditorium for that purpose. Congressman Hamilton's topic today is making government work through greater accountability. Please join me in welcoming Lee Hamilton to the University of Georgia.
Well, good afternoon to all of you, and thank you very much for the extraordinary hospitality that has been extended to me by the university, especially by Tom Loth, the dean here, and the faculty. I like this place so much. In April and May, I've come back for the second year in a row. When I wander around this campus out here, I wonder if I could get accepted into the law school here or somewhere, Tom, if I applied. What a delightful experience these students must have at the University of Georgia, and how very pleased I am to be here. We had a Speaker of the House some years ago by the name of John McCormick. Those of you who follow the works of the Congress carefully know the name. He was a great debater, and every now and then he'd step from the podium, the Speaker's podium, into the well of the House to participate in a debate. Someone on the other side of the aisle would invariably irritate him. And he'd turn to that person and bow very low and say, "I hold the gentleman from Iowa in minimum high regard." I want you to know, because of your association with the University of Georgia, I hold each of you in maximum high regard, and I'm delighted to be here. The dean mentioned I'd been in the Congress for 34 years. That's correct. I'll tell you a little story about that. I announced my retirement one day and made a very bad mistake. I did a little bragging. Always a mistake to brag, I guess, but in this case it came back to bite me, and I said I'd been in the Congress 34 years and I'd cast over 16,000 votes. I went back to my office. I had a call from a constituent, said, "Lee, I understand you announced your retirement today." I said, "Yes." He said, "I understand you cast over 16,000 votes." I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, I want you to know you finally made a decision I agree with." So I had a lot of fun in the Congress, and I used to keep little, sayings that were made on the floor and in politics, and I'll tell you about my all-time favorite bumper sticker. We had some years ago a Catholic priest in the Congress. I think I'm correct in saying that a Catholic priest cannot be elected anymore to Congress, but some of you may know the name Father Drinan. He had the all-time best bumper sticker. When he ran in Boston, it said, "Vote for Father Drinan, or go to hell." I never quite had that kind of courage myself. Let me say a word to the Willoughbys here about this lecture. I'm going to be talking about accountability, but only from a narrow perspective of the Congress. But the topic of accountability is such an important one in American government, state, local, federal, that I'm just immensely pleased that they have seen fit to make that the topic of the lectures, accountability, and I commend you for that and for your sponsorship of this program. We're in the midst right now of a very heated presidential election. For the first time since 1952, you do not have a president, a sitting president, or vice president asking for your vote. So whatever this election may be about, it is not an exercise of accountability of a president or a vice president's record. We usually conceive of elections as the time when we evaluate our leaders, look at their records in office. Sometimes we choose to keep them, sometimes we choose to boot them out. But we want to reward him or her with another term of office if the job has been well done. That's accountability. But this year, we see the limits of elections as tools of accountability because you don't have a president or vice president running. But very fortunately, accountability is far more diverse and wide-ranging than the mere fact of pulling a lever in an election booth, as important as that is. Government exists in order to respond to the hopes and the needs, the ambitions, the desires, the wants of the people. And people surely want their government to perform many, many tasks competently, efficiently, and well. And they certainly want accountability from their government officials. They want the laws to be faithfully executed. They want them to be fairly and efficiently administered. And believe you me, they are deeply distressed when government fails in a task and no one is held accountable, as I'm afraid happens altogether too often. And when our government deviates from accountability, we further erode the confidence of the people in government and our system. Now we've got a complicated system. State, local, federal, executives, legislators, judges, they all, in a sense, have a responsibility to hold each other accountable. Accountability in government is a vast subject, and I'm only going to speak to one fairly narrow part of it. I cannot cover it comprehensively in one lecture. But since I was in the Congress for a good many years, I'm going to focus on the role of the Congress and its responsibility for accountability in government. Now, Congress at its best brings a lot of strength to our system of government. Among other things, it is accessible. If you've got a problem with government, let's talk about the federal government, it's pretty hard for you to call up and say, Mr. President, I'd like to have a chat with you about this. Pretty hard for you to call up the Vice President. Pretty hard for you to call up the Secretary of this, that, or the other. Pretty hard for you to call up the Deputy Assistant Secretary. Now, it's not because these people don't want to talk to you. It's because they're pretty busy, and this is a big country. But you can call up, and in most cases, reach your congressman, congresswoman, or your senator. Now, I understand pretty well, I think, the limitations of the Congress. But at least the ordinary citizen has a chance to engage his or her representative and to demand accountability. The most ingenious form of accountability in our system, of course, seamlessly woven into the fabric of our republic, is our system of checks and balances, uniquely American and the product of our founders' ingenuity. 3 branches of government, each holds the other accountable. Now, I'm going to quote James Madison a couple of times here. I've got a bias. All of us have our favorite figures in American history. Certainly one of mine is James Madison. And I'll make this statement about him. He could not possibly get elected to Congress. He only stood over 5 feet tall, just barely. His face was pockmarked. He was a lousy speaker. Socially inept. You know all about Dolly Madison. But he just happened to be a political genius, that's all. But if you saw him on television today, you say, oh my gosh, I can't have that guy representing me. That tells us a little bit about where we are. But he said in the Federalist 47, I'm not sure everybody got your message there. Doesn't bother me. I've spoken to groups that don't pay any attention at all. The United States Congress, for one. A few bells going off doesn't bother me in the slightest. So just put it back and we'll go on. James Madison said, and I quote now, "The accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands, whether of one, few, or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny." And so we have this system of 3 branches. For the judiciary, they have to hold the President and the Congress accountable for acting according to the Constitution. For the Congress, we have to try to hold the President accountable for making the laws work as they are intended, asking questions like, are the laws achieving their purpose? Are resources being used efficiently? Is authority being exercised properly? And for the President, of course, respecting the constitutional powers delegated to the Congress and the courts is essential while executing the laws. Madison was very cognizant, even fearful, of too much power in the executive branch. I quote again, "In a government where numerous and extensive prerogatives are placed in the hands of a hereditary monarch, the executive department is very justly regarded as the source of danger and watched with all the jealousy which a zeal for liberty ought to inspire." And so you know from your constitutional history that there were all kinds of steps taken to limit the power of the executive and to give the Congress quite a bit of power, to declare war, to enact taxes, to set the budget of the United States government. How are we doing in the Congress? If you want it in a single line, not well enough. That's the short answer. Now look, I understand that one of America's favorite indoor sports is to criticize the Congress. It's a very easy thing to do, isn't it? I know, I've done it a lot myself. Mark Twain said, suppose you were an idiot, and suppose you were a member of Congress. But I repeat myself. There's that magnificent statue of Will Rogers right outside the chamber of the House of Representatives. If you've probably seen it if you've been there, the Capitol. Probably my favorite statue in the whole building. As you know, each state can put 2 statues in. Statutes. I get them mixed up a little bit. Statues. Will Rogers said that Congress was a never-ending source of amusement, amazement, and discouragement. But even then, we honor him with that statue. But I do believe today that the Congress is an institution that is under stress. I do not think it is living up to its responsibility as a co-equal branch of government. And that leads to a government of unequal branches, and that means that government does not work as well or as transparently as it should. Now, this is not an immediate phenomenon. We've had, over a period of decades, a flow of power to the executive branch. And all of this while, the Congress has been timid. And they've put diminished emphasis on oversight. I'll have more to say about that in a moment. But let me share with you some of my current concerns about the Congress and its power. I think the Congress has ceded too much power to the president. That's the bottom line. Vice President Cheney is often quoted here, and he believes and has often stated that one of the principal achievements in the Bush administration has been the drive to centralize and expand the power of the presidency. He said, and I quote him, "I think there has been over time a restoration, if you will, of the power and authority of the president," speaking of the Bush tenure in office. And he believes that's just and proper and a major accomplishment of the Bush administration. To me, the problem is that Congress has become too reluctant to assert its power. Now, I don't want you to misunderstand me here. I do not favor a weak president. I favor a strong president, and I favor a strong Congress. And I believe the theory, if you will, of the Constitution is that you have a strong president and a strong Congress. There is tension between the 2 institutions, executive and legislative, but out of that tension, there emerges better public policy. That's kind of a premise for me. So I want a strong president and a strong Congress. Well, you say to me, well, the Congress has the power of the purse. Be careful of that. Year after year, the president sends a budget to the Congress. About 95% of that budget is simply rubber stamped by the Congress. Sometimes 97, 98%, sometimes 93%. Now, what the Congress changes around, $100 million here, $200 million there, is not unimportant, but don't fool yourself. The chief budget officer of the United States government is the President of the United States. Now, every now and then I see this statement from some member of the Congress saying that, well, the president's budget is dead on arrival. That's baloney. We got a stronger word for it in Indiana. I'll call it baloney in Georgia. Rubber stamp. The budget of the United States, the power of the purse. You know where the real debates take place on the budget? Not in the Congress, in the Office of Management and Budget. within the White House. Or let's take another power. The Congress has the power to declare war. Anybody believe that? We've written it right, well, we haven't written it out, we've just ignored it. When was the last time the Congress declared war? I don't know the answer to my own question. Sometime in World War II, somebody told me the other day, is Bulgaria. I'll take their word for it. I don't really know, but it's been a long, long time ago. And of course, we've committed troops all over the world since then for hostilities. We go to war, we intervene about once every 2 years since the end of World War II. Not once have we declared war. Well, somebody says, well, you pass a resolution, as they did for the present war in Iraq. But be careful there. You know what that resolution said? What it said, and I'm paraphrasing here, is, Mr. President, it's all yours. Whatever you decide, we'll support you. Congress shall have the power to declare war? Not even close. One of the other powers it has is supposed to set the legislative agenda. President George Washington would not submit a budget to the Congress because he didn't think it was his job. He would not submit legislative proposals overall to the Congress because he didn't think it was his job. President Washington wouldn't recognize what we do today. So I think the Congress has a responsibility to ensure that it's a co-equal branch of government, and no one can make the argument today that the Congress is a co-equal branch of government. You cannot sustain that argument. Not even close. Now, the timidity and the weakness of the Congress pops up in a lot of different ways. You saw it argued yesterday, didn't you? If you listened to those hearings, a few members of the Congress, the Senate, were saying, look here, General, and look here, Mr. Ambassador, you better send that status of forces agreement to the Congress. No, we're not going to do that, the ambassador said. No, we're not going to do that, the general said. We're going to do it ourselves. We have a status of forces agreement with 80 countries around the world. They've all been submitted to the Congress. Not this time. Now, what you did see yesterday is an exercise of oversight. And I want to talk about that because I believe it's the responsibility of the Congress to have tough, continuous oversight of the executive branch. It has a lot of purposes. Obviously, to evaluate a program administration, to evaluate how we're running the war in Iraq. That was the purpose yesterday, wasn't it? And you had an opportunity to see it, so did I. I applaud that. That's terrific. Oversight is to make sure programs conform to the congressional intent. It's to ferret out waste, fraud, and abuse. It's to see whether or not a program has outlived its usefulness. It's to compel an explanation of policy. That's a very important part of oversight because the executive branch oftentimes does not want to tell you what the policy is. And one of the jobs of the member of Congress is to make a representative of the White House, of the president, to tell us what the policy is. You saw the senators pushing yesterday. General, tell us, what's your plan here for training Iraqi troops? What's your plan to get out of Iraq? Well, the general didn't answer that. Members of Congress have every right to ask it and to push. And if the executive branch doesn't want to answer, that's their choice. But the Congress is playing the proper role when it pushes for an answer. I think good congressional oversight is absolutely fundamental to the operation of democracy. I think the job is to look into every nook and cranny of the federal government. Appalling things happen in the shadows. appalling. And one of the jobs of the Congress is to turn that spotlight on and make the executive defend their policy and to articulate their policy so that we all understand it. Are the federal programs working? Is this law living up to its expectations? Is this venture in Iraq achieving what we want it to achieve? Are policies being implemented? Is the program cost effective? Now, they got all kinds of tools to do this in the Congress. You saw it yesterday, of course, in the hearings, but you have periodic reauthorization of bills. You have visits by members of Congress. Incidentally, I don't criticize members of Congress for traveling around the world. I sometimes think most of them don't do enough of it. I don't know how you understand problems from your own independent point of view unless you see it. A lot of people can help you understand it better, but nothing like first-hand experience. You have the Government Accountability Office, you got subpoenas, you got investigations, you've got reports. There are all kinds of ways the Congress can exercise its oversight. But I don't think the record's very good. We've heard an awful lot about pre-war claims regarding the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Most of that criticism is levied, of course, at President Bush. But what about the Congress? They had the same information the president had. Where were they? I don't think the Congress educated itself or the American people about how much the Iraq War was going to cost. You remember the claims, all the Iraqis will pay for it with their oil revenues. The estimates were 25 billion. Well, we know that's off the mark. You want to blame the president? Okay. He deserves some of the responsibility. How about the Congress? Why didn't they give us some figures on the cost of the war? They passed a Medicare prescription drug bill. 4 or 5 days after the bill was passed, they found out that they had underestimated the cost by $100 billion. How in the world do you underestimate something by $100 billion? You got to work pretty hard to do that. That's Congress's estimate. They voted on the bill. Oops, we made a mistake. We underestimated the cost. $100 billion. What's going on here? Is that oversight? Is that looking into every nook and cranny of the federal government? Everybody agrees now about the prisoner abuse in Iraq and Afghanistan and Guantanamo Bay. The dean told me the other day you had 4 or 5 secretaries of state here. They all condemned it. Fine. Blame the president? What about the Congress? Where are they? How do you feel about mistreating prisoners? I know a lot of people think it's a pretty good idea. I don't. I'm appalled by it. That's not my country to treat people like that. That's not the United States of America that I know to torture people. Where was the Congress? Congress created the Department of Homeland Security. Then they have the oversight structure. You know how many committees look into the oversight of the Department of Homeland Security? 80 in the House. Now think, if you're the Secretary of Homeland Security, who do you report to? You can't report to 80 people, 80 subcommittees. That's not good oversight, and so it goes. The oversight is broken in so many ways: infrequent hearings, too much concern for protecting the committee's turf, too much focus on scoring political points and not enough on policy, a lack of focus on long-term problems like the budget and trade deficit. I was talking to some of the faculty members a little earlier today. What's the Congress doing investigating whether Roger Clemens used drugs or not? Isn't that a matter for Major League Baseball? Well, I was going to say who cares. We ought to care, obviously. But to me, it was off the mark. There's so many other things the Congress ought to be looking into about the federal government. Let Major League Baseball handle Roger Clemens. Now, there are a lot of reasons for this decline of oversight. The Congress is not working as hard as it used to. They come in on Tuesday afternoon, they leave Thursday night. They vote a few times Tuesday night on renaming post offices here and there. They work on Wednesday pretty hard. They work on Thursday. By Thursday afternoon, everybody's going to the speaker and say, I got to get out of here. I got to give a speech on Friday. The shorter work week means they do less oversight. The authorizing committees have declined in power. You know, this is tough business oversight. It's tedious. It's not glamorous. Sometimes they try to make it glamorous. I was in my office one day and I had a call from one of my colleagues and said, I want to bring Miss America over here to see you. Well, I kind of enjoyed that, to be blunt with you. I had a very nice talk with Miss America. That's the only time a guy my age could have a talk with Miss America. Well, what's that got to do with anything? If I'd had a chance to squire Miss America around, I'd probably taken it up, but that's got nothing to do with the Congress. There are a lot of things more important in terms of their responsibilities. The media doesn't pay enough attention to traditional oversight. Now, sometimes they get zeroed in on a problem, and I think they do a pretty good job, but by and large, oversight is too tedious for them. It's not glamorous enough. It's not romantic. It's not sexy, and so the media doesn't stay with it. I don't know about you as a constituent. I suspect there's not a person in here that has ever said to their congressional representative, I want you to do some more work on oversight. Has anybody ever said that? You don't need to answer it. You may know how they vote or don't vote, and you should. I applaud that. But look, in the Congress, you're assigned to a committee, and that committee may have responsibility for the Department of Education or the Department of Agriculture or the Department of this, that, and the other. And by golly, if you're assigned that responsibility, you ought to know what's going on in that department. Everything that's going on. And you ought to be visiting that department, and you ought to be talking to the secretary and the undersecretary and the deputy secretary about the programs they administer. Now, I know how good oversight works. It has to be bipartisan if it's going to be good. Now, I'm not starry-eyed about this. I understand the Republicans and Democrats are going to differ from time to time on what oversight ought to be done. That's fine. Nothing wrong with that. But on the question of can you make the government work better, surely the Congress, the Republicans and the Democrats can agree with one another. Surely. We all want government to work better. You've got to have a constructive relationship between Congress and the implementing agency, that's for sure. You've got to do it on a regular and systematic basis. You've got to do it on a comprehensive basis. Oversight is often driven by or judged by how many cameras you can get in the room. And you usually get a lot of cameras in the room if you got a celebrity there to testify. Well, I'm not against celebrities, but they're not always the most authoritative source on a problem. I've got a lot of good stuff here I'm skipping over. The dean's getting a little restless up here. Now, let me say there's such a thing as too much oversight. The executive branch will complain all the time that the Congress is micromanaging. That can be a valid complaint. Of course, they call almost anything micromanaging because they don't want any oversight. But members of Congress have to be sensitive to that. Now, what does the Congress have to do to become a co-equal branch of government, to strengthen its oversight efforts, to make government more accountable? There's a very simple answer to state here. It's very easy to do, but in a word, the Congress has to reclaim its constitutional powers. It needs to exercise the political will to get its house in order and to assert itself. Congress has to take its seat at the table in formulating the policy agenda of the nation and not just be reactive to the president's agenda. It should be reactive to the president's agenda, but it should put forth its own agenda as well. It has to pass the laws of the nation by using a fair process. It has to pass its own budget. It has to deliberate carefully and extensively. The hardest job in politics today is building a consensus. If you want my advice on who to elect in your next round of voting, vote for whatever party you want to. But I hope you'll ask yourself, can this candidate, whether for Congress or county commissioner, you have county commissioners in Georgia? That's what we call them in Indiana. Or president. If you ask the question, can this person bring the country, the county, the city together? Now look, anybody can go into a room where you got differences of opinion and blow it apart. I know because I've done it on occasion. You know what's really hard? What's really hard is to go into that room where you got a difference of opinion and bring people together. That's political skill. It's needed in government, it's needed in the hospital board, it's needed in the church board of trustees, it's needed all over government and in the private sector as well, the ability to bring people together. That is the great political skill. I believe the Congress is a resilient institution. I think it'll begin to reassert itself over time if you and the American people begin to speak up on this question. And I want to move to that as I conclude. You know, responsibility for accountability in government doesn't rest only with Congress, it rests with you and me. And the American people are the most powerful force for change. That goes beyond voting, of course. Fortunately, we've got whistleblowers in this country. You may not like whistleblowers. I like whistleblowers. Fortunately, we've got prosecutors in this country. You may not like prosecutors. I like prosecutors. If we didn't have prosecutors, I don't know what would happen. Now, do they overstep their authority? Of course they do, now and then. Do we need the media in this country? You bet we do. I was talking to one of our leading newspaper people the other day, editor of a vast news enterprise. You'd all know the name of the publication. I said, how many investigative reporters do you have? He said, we're doing away with them. Investigative reporters are hugely important in my view, too, because they exercise oversight. Even the bloggers. I made a statement the other day. I had 348 bloggers criticizing me. Can you imagine that? I mean, I'm a nice guy. They just ripped the hell out of me. I didn't even know how to get at them. I don't even know how to get at them. But they didn't like what I had to say. I figured that out. Bloggers have their role. Alexander Hamilton said about the Congress, "Here, sir," about the House, "Here, sir, the people govern. The people govern." But the point is, it's not going to work very well unless you and I make it work. And if we do not, the chances increase that government will not be held accountable and the greater good cannot be advanced. So making the government work is not just the job of the Congress, not just the job of the President, not just the job of the Supreme Court. It's the job of every single one of us. If a member of Congress is not sticking up for the institution itself, then they're not sticking up for your interests. One of the easiest things in the world is to run against the Congress. That's the way people run for Congress today, to run against the Congress. I've done that too. I can do it in my sleep. Probably have. You can always make yourself look good and the institution look lousy. You ever seen that technique? Almost every member of the Congress practices. I used to do it. Then I got to be a senior member of Congress, and I said to myself, who speaks for the Congress? How long can we go on in this nation degrading the Congress and still have representative democracy? Somebody pointed out to me, Howard, I think it was you a little earlier, 18% of the people approve the work of the Congress. That means a pretty good percentage don't approve of it. How far down that path can you go and have a representative democracy? Who speaks for the Congress? It used to be the Speaker of the House would speak for the Congress. I'm not sure that's true anymore. Used to be the majority and minority leaders. I began to feel a sense of responsibility. Even when I was in the minority, I said to myself, look, I've been around here a while. I have some responsibility for this institution. And so I didn't always approve of what Congress did, but I tried to explain it. And I backed off some of my harsher criticism. When you're sworn into the House of Representatives or the Senate, you hold up your right hand, of course, and you take an oath of office, and the oath of office says, in effect, will you support and defend the Constitution of the United States? It doesn't say, will you support and defend the President of the United States? It does not say you will support and defend your constituents. It does not say you will support and defend your largest campaign contributor. You will support and defend the Constitution of the United States. Now, look, not all of us agree on exactly what the Constitution means, but surely it means that we support a government of three co-equal branches of government, each trying to hold the other accountable. So, Congress has to assert itself. It has to speak up. It has to challenge the executive when necessary, work with it as a partner when that's appropriate, insist on accountability at all times. But if you really want accountability in government, you have to do your part as well. Thank you very much.
We have time for some questions. Those who have questions would invite you to come to the microphones on either side.
My perspective is that I'm a war veteran. I hold the Army Commendation Medal and Purple Heart. From that perspective, I was terrified a couple weeks ago when I saw an interview with Judy Woodruff, with the Vice President Oman, when she asked him a question. Mr. Vice President, 73% of the American people are against the war in Iraq. And his answer was, so, good thought, sir.
Well, I was a little shocked at the answer. It seemed to me to be an answer that was dismissive of the views of the American people. Now, there is a problem here. I believe that the foreign policy of the United States has been and is today a very elitist operation. And I think it's a serious problem in our government. I think that there is a feeling among many in government that you folks out there just aren't smart enough, intelligent enough to understand what's going on in the world, especially a complex situation like Iraq. A feeling that you're not able to master the subject and that you had better leave it to people who know a little more about it than you do. If I have heard this once, I've heard it 1,000 times. Trust me, Lee, I know. I don't buy it. I think we should pay attention to the words of the psalmist. You know what it says in the Psalms? Put not your faith in princes. Now look, Ronald Reagan had it right. Trust but verify. And I look at the polls today. I picked one up the other day. Number one, it said the American people wanted to exit Iraq responsibly. Number two, it said they wanted to go after Osama bin Laden. You know, he's wandering around over there in Pakistan. Number three, it said you want the Americans to engage in diplomacy, not just with your enemies, but with your friends. Then it said we want to reduce our dependence on foreign oil. And then it said we ought to maintain strong alliances. And I went through that poll and I said to myself, well, in Indiana, we'd call that a down-home judgment. Now, look, I'm not starry-eyed about this either. I don't romanticize that the American people are always right. But neither am I comfortable with a view that is dismissive of the American people. The American people are the ones that carry the burden of American foreign policy. I have a habit every day. I don't know why I do it. I pick up the newspaper and I look at the casualty list in Iraq. I don't know the names of the young men and women. Oftentimes, I don't even know the towns they're from. But I think every day for a few fleeting seconds of the heartache, the agony of a spouse or of a parent or a child. Am I to be dismissive of their views? Every one of you pay an awful lot of taxes. So, I didn't like the answer. Maybe you got that from my observations.
Thank you very much for your remarks on the oversight function of the Congress. I've been thinking more deeply lately about something you've been touching on as well, the oversight function of the voting American people. And something that has concerned me as I have tried to inform myself of some of the pressing issues our country faces is the ignorance and the tendency of both the media and a large segment of the the American people to not seem to be interested in Iraq or the environment or the budget deficit or the issue. Sometimes Britney Spears seems to be more interesting. I wonder if you have any advice for how we can get a larger segment of the American people involved in thinking about and being aware of some of these serious issues.
Well, I think all of us get a little cynical perhaps at times and a little discouraged because we think the American people don't follow events as carefully as we like. I'm sure that's true on occasion. By and large, I come through my political experience with quite a bit of confidence in the underlying common sense, goodwill, decency of the American people. Most of our citizens are very good people, and they want their communities to work better and their government to work better. They're often disappointed in the performance of the politicians, of course. I don't know the answer to your question. I think the responsibility of an American citizen to inform himself or herself is very great, that the future of the Republic depends on it. It really does. And to the extent that we give in to ignorance or to cynicism, to that extent the system is gravely weakened. Now, let's be clear that an institution like the University of Georgia has a huge role to play here. Because where do we get discriminating citizens? And your country depends on your exercising discriminating judgment. Where do we get them if we do not get them from the universities of our land? I don't know where. So I am grateful to every professor, every dean, and everybody who works at this university for their efforts to make our students good American citizens by exercising discriminating judgment. There is nothing that's more important to the future of the country than that. I'm not pessimistic about this. I really am not. I visit a lot of college campuses and a lot of other places as well. I find engagement much more than I find disengagement. And a lot of young people in the audience today, they could speak to that better than I. But I have a confidence in the American people. It's tough, though, isn't it? One of the great temptations is to read only those people you agree with. I fall prey to that, I'm sure, from time to time. Maybe you do too. But the fact of the matter is, issues today are complicated and you need to get different perspectives. And if you're going to be able to exercise that skill I was talking about of bringing people together, one of the things you surely have to do is to sit down and ask yourself, what is their view? What's the core of it? What is the core of my view? And where can we bridge the gap, and where can we not bridge the gap? In the Iraq Study Group, we had 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, all partisans. And Jim Baker and I came up against this all of the time. How do you bring people together? We concluded that the report would be of no value if it was split on party lines or any other way. So we worked very hard to bring together, and the amazing thing is that when people feel a sense of responsibility, they, with a little effort, can come together.
The president has been touting political success in Iraq as part of the surge strategy, and elections were a key component to having the surge work, the elections in Iraq and continuing political progress. And I was recently looking for class at the Iraqi elections. I found that 22% of their parliament supported an outsider who has been less than helpful to us at times, and that 15% wanted to make Saddam a national hero. And
You don't always get the result you want in an election. I don't think that you favor the Republicans and the Democrats win or vice versa. I'm thinking now about Iraq, where we've had a whole series of elections, and it has not achieved what we all want to see achieved, as a national reconciliation. The election in many ways in Iraq has exacerbated the differences because it has created the Sunnis here and the Shias there and the Kurds there. That doesn't mean that elections are invalid. It just means that democracy is a difficult process, gets a little messy at times. Hamas won the election in the Palestinian territories. That has caused us an awful lot of heartburn. Musharraf gets beat in Pakistan. Caused a lot of people heartburn, not me so much, but caused a lot of people heartburn in Pakistan. So you do get results that do not always favor American policy. But look, democracy is not a result. Democracy is a process. And we have to understand that, and we have to understand that we're not going to win all these elections. You have to work with them and keep working at them to make the process work better. And that's exactly what we have to do in Iraq. Now we hope they have provincial elections coming up here shortly. Not sure whether they'll come off or not, but they may. And if they do, they may be a step towards healing. But they may not be, as some of the past elections have not been in Iraq. So your question is about the results of democracy, and I'm saying to you that democracy is less about results and much more about process, and we want to try to get the process right if we can, even though we may get some results that we may not favor. But when you get a result that you do not favor, let's take the popularity of Hamas not only in Gaza but in the West Bank. There are people who draw the conclusion from that we should have nothing to do with Hamas. I think that's a mistake, personally. I don't see how you solve the problems of the Palestinians without including Hamas. After all, they speak for more than half of the Palestinians, far more than half. Do they take a lot of positions I don't like? You bet they do. But you don't solve problems by talking only to people who agree with you. So I believe you have to talk. And the election process is good and should go forward, but we have to be mature enough to understand that some of the results can run counter to our views and our policy. Okay. Wrap it up here.
Final question.
Very good. We'll take this one last question, and then you all can be relieved of the burden. Okay.
What are your thoughts on Democratic presidential candidates and their plans to fly Iraq in 30 days or 90 days?
I don't agree with it. I know that the Democratic Party in the Congress, and I know the position of the Democratic candidates for president, have often taken the view that you have certain timetables. I think that's what you're referring to. I do not think you can set policy on the basis of timetables. And therefore, I do not agree with most of my colleagues in my own party when they talk about that. Now, I do agree that I want to see the United States exit responsibly from Iraq. I strongly disagree with the policy that we have today of giving Maliki unconditional aid. Maliki's got that figured out, my friends. We've been giving him that unconditional aid now for several years. We tell him we want him to accomplish certain things. He doesn't do anything about it, doesn't accomplish those things, and we give him another check. So there's no pressure on him. So I don't like the idea of unconditional aid, and I therefore like the idea of putting more pressure on Maliki, both in money and in saying to him, Mr. Maliki, you have got to begin getting your government in order, not just a Shia government, but a government of all the people. You've got to do it now. We're going to leave. We're not going to stay here forever. We're going to leave gradually, slowly, steadily, and no more of this unconditional aid. That's what I would do in Iraq. I would not set rigid timetables. The idea of withdrawing from Iraq is a lot more complicated than people think. You basically got one road, don't you? From Baghdad to Kuwait, that's where most of the exiting would have to occur. That's not exactly interstate highway. We got 140, 50, 60,000 troops there, but we also have 140, 50, 60,000 civilians. We have built whole towns in Iraq. Our military bases are a sight to behold. The engineers have gone in there and put in sanitation and water. I go into the mess hall in Baghdad and other places in Iraq. They have more flavors of ice cream than I get in the local drugstore. We ship it all in. We have tons and tons and tons of equipment, buildings. How do you get that all out of Iraq? Not going to be done in a few months, I'll tell you that. And just think, long line of American forces moving down that highway, very exposed, very subject to attack. And you can see the idea of withdrawal has not been very well thought out. Now, let me conclude simply by saying that, Iraq's a complicated matter, and I don't have time to talk about it now, and you don't want to listen to it. But the point is that our debate today with regard to Iraq, highly partisan, very shallow. Republicans are talking about success or victory. Well, what does that mean? Democrats are talking about withdrawal. What does that mean? Surely in the course of this presidential campaign, between now and the time we vote on these folks, we will have forced them to spell out their views a little more accurately than they have, more substantively than they have thus far. Long answer to a simple question. I don't agree with the timetables. Thank you very much.
Everyone is invited to join us for a reception in the foyer of Candler Hall. Candler is the building behind this building and adjacent to Hurdy Field. I want to conclude by thanking Congressman Hamilton for his service to our nation, and to thank him for his contribution to civil discourse about the future of our country. You honor us by your presence here, and we thank you.